I'm Sarah Martinez, 28, and 3 years ago I made a mistake that would cost me my weekends, my holidays, and nearly my sanity. I said yes to babysitting my nephew once, just once, and somehow that single favor turned into an unpaid part-time job that consumed my life. But when I finally calculated the numbers, tallied every hour, every meal, every broken item, and sent them a legal invoice for over $15,000, their laughter died pretty quickly, especially when the small claims court summons arrived at their door. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up as the youngest of 3 sisters in the Martinez family meant I was used to being overlooked, but I never thought that would extend into my adult life in such a calculated way. My sister Carmen, 3rd of 4, had always been the golden child, the one who got married first, bought a house first, and had kids first. She had this way of making every conversation about her needs, her struggles, her overwhelming schedule as a working mom. Meanwhile, my middle sister Rosa, 31, had perfected the art of being conveniently unavailable whenever family obligations arose. It started innocently enough back in March of 2021. Carmen called me on a Thursday evening, her voice strained with exhaustion. "Sarah, I'm desperate. Miguel has been working double shifts at the warehouse, and I've got this mandatory training session for work tomorrow night. Could you possibly watch little Diego for just a few hours? I know it's last minute, but you're the only one I can count on." Diego was 5 at the time, Carmen's only child, and honestly, he was a sweet kid. I had a decent relationship with my nephew, and Carmen sounded genuinely stressed. I was working as a customer service representative for a local insurance company, pulling in about $37,000 a year, which wasn't much but covered my rent on a small 1-bedroom apartment in Basic Crawl. Expenses. My Friday nights were usually spent binge-watching Netflix and eating takeout, so helping families seemed like the right thing to do. "Of course," I said, not thinking twice about it. "What time do you need me there?" The relief in Carmen's voice was palpable. "Oh, Sarah, you're a lifesaver. Can you be here by 6? I should be back by 10, 11 at the latest. I'll have Diego fed and ready for bed, so it should be easy." That first night went smoothly. Diego and I watched cartoons, played with his action figures, and I tucked him into bed around 8:30. Carmen came home at 10:15, thanked me profusely, and pressed a $20 bill into my hand despite my protests. "For your time and gas," she insisted. I felt good about helping, like I was being a good aunt and sister. But that $20 would be the first and last payment I'd receive for babysitting services over the next 3 years. The requests became more frequent after that. Carmen would call every couple of weeks, always with a different urgent need. Miguel was working late again. She had a work event. Diego had a half-day at school, and she couldn't leave early. She needed to run errands without a 5-year-old in tow. Each time, I said yes. Each time, she promised it would be just this once, just until things settled down. By summer, the requests had evolved into expectations. Carmen no longer called to ask if I was available. She would text me her schedule and assume I'd accommodate it. "Diego's school is closed Monday for teacher planning. Can you pick him up from daycare at 3 and watch him until I get off work at 6? Or, Miguel and I have dinner plans Saturday night. Diego will be ready for pickup at 5. I started to feel the weight of these obligations more heavily as they interfered with my own life. I missed a friend's birthday party because I was watching Diego. I had to cancel a date because Carmen needed me to babysit on short notice. I turned down overtime shifts at work because my weekends were increasingly consumed by childcare duties. The breaking point should have come during Thanksgiving of 2021. Carmen and Miguel had been invited to Miguel's boss's house for dinner, a networking opportunity that Carmen insisted was crucial for his career advancement. Naturally, children weren't invited, so Diego needed supervision. But instead of asking me, Carmen announced at our family dinner 2 weeks prior that I would be watching Diego on Thanksgiving. "Sarah doesn't have any real plans anyway," she said casually, cutting into her turkey. "And it's just for a few hours in the afternoon." I looked around the table at my parents, at Rosa, waiting for someone to point out that maybe I should have been consulted about this arrangement. Instead, my mother nodded approvingly. "That's very thoughtful of you, Sarah. Family comes first." What was I supposed to say? That I did have plans. That I'd been looking forward to a quiet Thanksgiving watching movies and cooking a small dinner for myself. That I was tired of being the default babysitter, while Rosa somehow never got volunteered for these duties. The words stuck in my throat, and I nodded silently, already mentally canceling my own plans. That Thanksgiving, while Carmen and Miguel networked over prime rib and wine, I sat in their living room eating leftover pizza and watching Diego play video games. He was good company, don't get me wrong, but the principle of the situation was starting to eat at me. I was 26 years old, working full-time, and my weekends and holidays were no longer my own. The pattern continued to escalate throughout 2022. Carmen got promoted to a management position at her marketing firm, which meant more evening events, more networking opportunities, more occasions where she needed childcare. Miguel started taking on additional contracting work on weekends to supplement their income as they saved for a bigger house. Somehow, all of these developments translated into more responsibilities for me. By this point, I was babysitting Diego at least twice a week, often on short notice. My small apartment became a second home for him, as Carmen would drop him off before work when his school had early dismissal days, or when he was too sick to go to daycare, but not sick enough to require her to miss work. My refrigerator was stocked with juice boxes and string cheese. My living room had a permanent corner dedicated to his toys and books. The financial impact was becoming significant. I was feeding Diego dinner at least 8 times a month, buying snacks and drinks he preferred, occasionally purchasing toys or games to keep him entertained during long babysitting sessions. When we went to the park or the movies, I paid for tickets and treats. If Diego had an accident or spilled something, I was the one buying replacement items or paying for cleaning. But more than the money, it was the complete lack of consideration for my time and autonomy that was wearing me down. Carmen never asked if I had plans, never seemed to consider that I might want to date, travel, or simply have a weekend to myself. Rosa had somehow established herself as perpetually unavailable, always having work commitments or social obligations that precluded babysitting duty. The most infuriating part was how Carmen had started to frame my babysitting as a favor to me. "Diego just loves spending time with his Aunt Sarah," she'd say when dropping him off. "You two have such a special bond." Or, "I know how much you enjoy having him around, so I figured you wouldn't mind watching him while I run these errands." It was manipulative in the most subtle way. How could I object to spending time with my nephew without seeming cold or selfish? How could I explain that while I did love Diego, I didn't love having my entire life revolve around his schedule without seeming like a terrible aunt? The situation reached a new level of absurdity in the spring of 2023. Carmen and Miguel had decided to take a weekend trip to celebrate their 8th wedding anniversary. They'd booked a bed and breakfast 2 hours away, planned romantic dinners and wine tastings, the whole 9 yards. And naturally, they'd assumed I would watch Diego for the entire weekend without even asking me first. "We're leaving Friday evening and coming back Sunday afternoon," Carmen informed me over the phone. "I know it's a big ask, but anniversary trips are so important for marriage, you know? We haven't had alone time in months." I had been planning to attend my coworker Janet's wedding that Saturday. I'd already bought a dress, arranged for a +1, and was looking forward to a fun evening with colleagues outside of work. But when I mentioned this to Carmen, her response was swift and sharp. "Sarah, this is our first real getaway in over a year. Surely Janet's wedding isn't more important than supporting your sister's marriage. You can send a nice gift and your regrets." The expectation that I would cancel my own plans, that my social life was somehow less important than theirs, hit me like a slap. But I found myself agreeing anyway, rationalizing that family obligations did come first, that I was being selfish for wanting to prioritize a coworker's wedding over my nephew's needs. That weekend, while Carmen and Miguel enjoyed couples massages and gourmet meals, I missed Janet's wedding, spent $60 on groceries to feed Diego for 3 days, and discovered that he'd accidentally broken my laptop screen while playing games. The repair cost me $340, money I couldn't really afford on my modest salary. When Carmen returned, relaxed and glowing from her romantic getaway, she thanked me briefly and mentioned that Diego had told her about the laptop. "Kids will be kids," she said with a laugh. At least it wasn't something more expensive. No offer to pay for the repair. No acknowledgement that this accident had happened while he was in my care because I was providing free childcare so she could go on vacation. Just a casual dismissal of a significant expense that I'd now have to absorb. It was around this time that I started to pay closer attention to the actual costs of my babysitting arrangement. I began keeping a mental tally of the money I was spending, the hours I was giving up, the opportunities I was missing. The numbers were staggering when I really thought about them. By summer of 2023, I was providing childcare for Diego, an average of 3 times per week. Sometimes it was just for a few hours in the evening, but often it extended to full days on weekends or holidays. I calculated that I was spending approximately 15 to 20 hours per week watching my nephew, which was essentially a part-time job that I was doing for free. If I were to charge the going rate for babysitting in our area, which was $12 to $15 per hour for experienced sitters, I was providing between $180 to $300 worth of fee. Childcare services per week. Over the course of a year, that was between $9,000 and $15,000 in unpaid labor. But it wasn't just the childcare itself. I was providing meals, snacks, entertainment, transportation, and dealing with the wear and tear on my apartment and belongings. Diego was now 7. Bigger and more energetic, and my small living space was taking a beating from his constant presence. My furniture was stained with juice and crayon marks. My carpet needed professional cleaning from various spills and accidents. My utility bills had increased noticeably from the extra electricity, water, and heating usage. The breaking point finally came in, late September of 2023. Carmen called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying that familiar tone of stressed entitlement that I'd grown to dread. "Sarah, I need a huge favor. Miguel's sister is getting married this weekend in Phoenix, and we absolutely have to attend. It's a family obligation, you understand, but the wedding is adults only, and we can't afford to fly Diego out there and pay for a separate hotel room. Could you possibly watch him from Friday through Monday? I know it's 4 days, but we'll make it up to you somehow." 4 days. They wanted me to provide round-the-clock childcare for 4 days while they flew to Arizona for a wedding. I would need to take time off work, completely clear my weekend, and essentially become a temporary single parent for nearly 100 hours. For the first time in 3 years, I said no. Carmen, I can't do it. I have plans this weekend, and taking 4 days off work isn't feasible for me. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Carmen finally spoke, her voice was as cold. Plans? What plans could you possibly have that are more important than family? Sarah, we're talking about a wedding here. This isn't optional for us. I understand that, but it's also not my responsibility to rearrange my entire life every time you have a commitment. I've been watching Diego constantly for 3 years. I need a break. A break? Carmen's voice rose in pitch. Sarah, you're his aunt. This is what family does for each other. I can't believe you're being so selfish and ungrateful. The words selfish and ungrateful hung in the air between us. After 3 years of sacrificing my weekends, my social life, my financial resources, and my personal space, I was being called selfish for finally setting a boundary. Ungrateful for what, exactly? I asked, my own voice beginning to shake with anger. For everything we've done for you. For including you in Diego's life. For trusting you with our son. For giving you the opportunity to be a real part of this family instead of just sitting alone in your apartment all the time. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. They were framing 3 years of unpaid labor as a favor to me, as if I should be thanking them for the privilege of providing free childcare that saved them thousands of dollars. I'll figure something else out, Carmen said curtly. But don't expect me to forget how unsupportive you've been when we really needed you. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my living room for a long time after that phone call, staring at the corner where Diego's toys were neatly arranged, thinking about the conversation. The more I replayed Carmen's words, the angrier I became, not just at her casual cruelty, but at myself for allowing this situation to continue for so long. That night, I did something I should have done years earlier. I sat down with a calculator and started documenting everything. I went through my bank statements, my credit card bills, my phone records, even my social media posts, to create a comprehensive record of every time I'd provided babysitting services for Diego over the past 3 years and 2 months. I calculated the hours, documented the expenses, and tallied up the true cost of my voluntary contributions to their family. The numbers were even worse than I'd estimated. From March 2021 through September 2023, I had provided approximately 2,040 hours of childcare services. At $15 per hour, which was the current market rate for experienced babysitters in our area, that represented $30,600 in unpaid labor. But that was just the beginning. I documented every meal I'd purchased for Diego, every snack, every drink, every toy, every movie ticket, every trip to the zoo or museum. I calculated the increased utility costs from his constant presence in my apartment. I itemized the damage to my belongings, from the laptop screen to furniture stains to carpet cleaning. The grand total was staggering. $37,240, nearly $40,000 that I had invested in my nephew's care, while Carmen painted me as the beneficiary of their generosity. I spent the next 2 weeks researching small claims court procedures and consulting with a legal aid attorney about my options. What I learned was both encouraging and infuriating. While family members typically provided childcare without expectation of payment, The fact that this arrangement had become so regular and extensive, and that I had absorbed significant costs in the process, created a reasonable expectation that I should be compensated for at least my documented expenses. The attorney helped me understand that while I couldn't necessarily claim payment for all the hours I'd worked, I had a strong case for reimbursement of my documented expenses related to Diego's care. The meals, the damaged property, the increased utility costs, the lost wages from missed overtime opportunities. These were all quantifiable losses that I'd incurred while providing what had essentially become a professional courtroom service. 2 weeks after Carmen's phone call, I sent a certified letter to her and Miguel. It was professional, detailed, and absolutely devastating. The letter outlined the scope of childcare services I'd provided over the past 3 years and 2 months, including specific dates, hours, and circumstances. It itemized my documented expenses with receipts and supporting documentation, and it presented them with an invoice for $15,860, representing my documented out-of-pocket costs and a modest portion of the market value of services provided. I gave them 30 days to respond with payment arrangements or a good faith effort to negotiate a reasonable settlement. Carmen called me within hours of receiving the letter, and she was absolutely furious. "Are you out of your mind? You're trying to charge us for babysitting your own nephew? This is the most ridiculous, greedy thing I've ever seen." "It's not ridiculous," I replied calmly. "It's documentation of the financial impact your childcare needs have had on my life over the past 3 years. If you had hired professional babysitters for all those hours, you would have paid significantly more than what I'm requesting." "But your family doesn't charge each other for favors." "Carmen, $37,000 in services and expenses isn't a favor. It's a job, and I've been doing that job for free, while you've benefited financially from not having to pay for professional childcare. This is insane. You're trying to destroy our family over money." "I'm trying to get fair compensation for 3 years of unpaid work. The fact that you see this as family destruction rather than family responsibility is pretty telling." The call ended with Carmen threatening to expose my greed to the whole family and warning me that I'd never see Diego again if I pursued this ridiculous money grab. True to her word, Carmen immediately launched a campaign to paint me as the villain in this situation. She called our parents, Rosa, various aunts and uncles, and family friends to share her version of events. According to Carmen's narrative, I was a bitter, jealous sister who was trying to extort money from a hard-working family out of spite and greed. The family response was swift and predictable. My parents called to express their disappointment in my mercenary behavior. Rosa texted me a long message about how embarrassed she was to be related to someone who would put a price tag on family love. Various relatives reached out to share their shock and disapproval. What none of them acknowledged was the 3 years of unpaid labor that had led to this point. What none of them questioned, was why Carmen had never compensated me for the thousands of dollars I'd spent on Diego's care. What none of them seemed to understand was that I wasn't asking to be paid for loving my nephew. I was asking to be reimbursed for the significant financial costs I'd absorbed while providing professional-level childcare services. The 30-day deadline came and went without any response from Carmen and Miguel beyond the initial angry phone call. No payment, no negotiation attempt, no acknowledgement that my documented expenses were legitimate. So I filed a small claims lawsuit. The process was more straightforward than I'd expected. The court clerk helped me prepare the necessary paperwork, and I presented my case with the same documentation I'd used for the initial invoice. I was seeking $15,860 in reimbursement for documented expenses related to child care services provided between March 2021 and September 2023. When the certified Ba summons was delivered to Carmen and Miguel's house, the family hysteria reached new heights. Carmen called me screaming about how I was dragging the family through the courts and threatening to make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had some power in this situation. I wasn't asking for their permission or their understanding. I wasn't trying to justify my needs or accommodate their schedules. I was simply presenting my case to an impartial judge and letting the legal system determine what was fair. The court date was set for November 15, 2023, about 6 weeks after I filed the paperwork. During those weeks, the family pressure was intense. My parents tried to convince me to drop the lawsuit for the sake of family unity. Rosa suggested that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and needed professional help. Various relatives offered to mediate a compromise that would allow everyone to save face. But what struck me most during this period was that not a single family member questioned the underlying facts of my case. No one disputed that I provided extensive childcare services. No one challenged my documentation of expenses. No one suggested that Carmen and Miguel should have been paying me all along. Their objection wasn't to the accuracy of my claims, but to the fact that I was making claims at all. In their minds, I was supposed to provide unlimited free labor because that's what family members do, especially unmarried female family members who apparently have nothing better to do with their time and money. A week before the court date, Miguel called me for the first time since this whole situation began. His approach was different from Carmen's aggressive tactics. He tried to appeal to my emotions and our relationship as in-laws. "Sarah, you know we care about you. You're an important part of Diego's life, and we don't want this situation to damage our family relationships permanently. Can't we work something out without involving the courts?" "What kind of something?" I asked. "Maybe we could pay you back for some of the expenses you documented. Not the full amount, because that seems excessive, but enough to show that we appreciate what you've done for us." "How much are you thinking?" "Well, we could probably manage $2,000 or $3,000. That would cover the big-ticket items like your laptop repair and some of the food costs." $2,000 or $3,000. Out of nearly $16,000 that I was requesting, which was itself less than half of the total value of services I'd provided. "Miguel, that's less than 20% of my documented expenses. It doesn't even begin to address the scope of what I've contributed to Diego's care over the past 3 years. But Sarah, you have to understand our financial situation. We're saving for a house. Carmen's student loans are still significant, and Miguel's work isn't always steady. We simply can't afford to pay you $15,000. The irony was breathtaking. They couldn't afford to pay me for childcare services, but they could afford to take anniversary trips to bed and breakfasts, fly to Arizona for weddings, and maintain the lifestyle that required extensive childcare support in the first place. If you couldn't afford childcare, maybe you should have adjusted your social calendar accordingly. I replied, "Professional babysitters don't work for free just because their clients have financial constraints." "But you're not a professional babysitter, you're Diego's aunt." "Exactly. Which means I provided family rates, family flexibility, and family reliability. And in return, I got family exploitation." Miguel sighed heavily. "I don't think we're going to resolve this over the phone. Let's just see what the judge says." The day of the small claims hearing was surprisingly anticlimactic. I arrived at the courthouse with a thick folder of documentation, bank statements, receipts, photographs of damaged property, a detailed timeline of babysitting dates and hours, testimony from friends about social events I'd missed due to childcare obligations, and a professional estimate of the market value of the services I'd provided. Carmen and Miguel arrived with their own folder, but it was noticeably thinner. They'd apparently decided to focus on character attacks rather than disputing the facts of my case. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Judge Patricia Hernandez, reviewed both sides' documentation before the hearing began. She asked clarifying questions about the timeline, the scope of services, and the documentation of expenses. When Carmen tried to argue that family members shouldn't charge each other for childcare, Judge Hernandez cut her off. "Ma'am, the issue before this court isn't whether family members should provide mutual support. The issue is whether the defendant owes reimbursement for documented expenses incurred by the plaintiff while providing extensive childcare services. The family relationship is relevant to the context, but it doesn't negate the plaintiff's right to compensation for legitimate expenses." Carmen's lawyer, a young man who seemed uncomfortable with the case, tried to argue that I had provided childcare voluntarily and couldn't retroactively demand payment, but Judge Hernandez had clearly done her homework on the relevant case law. Voluntary provision of services doesn't preclude reimbursement for documented expenses, particularly when the arrangement had become regular and extensive enough to create reasonable expectations of CAS. Compensation. The plaintiff has presented detailed documentation of out-of-pocket costs incurred directly in relation to childcare services. The defendants have not disputed the accuracy of these documented expenses. The hearing lasted about 40 minutes. I presented my case methodically, walking through the timeline, the escalation of responsibilities, and the documented costs. Carmen and Miguel's defense focused mainly on emotional appeals about family loyalty and their financial constraints. In the end, Judge Hernandez awarded me $11,200, representing reimbursement for my documented expenses, minus items she felt were too speculative or not directly related to childcare. It wasn't the full amount I'd requested, but it was a significant vindication of my position. The court finds that the plaintiff provided extensive childcare services over a period of more than 3 years, during which time she incurred substantial documented expenses related to the care of the defendant's child, Judge Hernandez stated in her ruling. While family members often provide mutual support without expectation of compensation, the scope and regularity of services provided in this case, combined with the significant financial burden placed on the plaintiff, creates a reasonable expectation of reimbursement for documented expenses. Carmen was visibly shaking as the judge read the ruling. Miguel sat with his head in his hands. Their lawyer gathered his papers quickly, clearly eager to escape the courtroom. As we left the courthouse, Carmen made one final attempt to salvage some moral high ground. "I hope you're happy, Sarah. You've destroyed our family for money. Diego asks about you constantly, and now I have to explain why his aunt sued his parents." "You can explain that his aunt finally stood up for herself after 3 years of being taken advantage of," I replied. "And you can explain that actions have consequences, even within families." The judgment required Carmen and Miguel to pay the $11,200 within 60 days. They paid it in installments over the next 3 months, each check arriving with obvious reluctance and accompanied by passive-aggressive notes about their financial hardship. The family fallout was exactly as dramatic as I'd expected. My parents didn't speak to me for months, convinced that I'd chosen money over family harmony. Rosa maintained that I'd had some kind of psychological breakdown and needed professional help to address my unhealthy obsession with money. Various relatives expressed their disappointment in my greed and lack of family values. But something interesting happened as the initial shock wore off. Other family members began to share their own stories of being taken advantage of by Carmen and Miguel. My cousin Lisa mentioned that she'd been expected to provide free graphic design services for Miguel's contracting business. My Aunt Patricia revealed that she'd been regularly asked to cook meals for family gatherings without any offers to split costs or provide reciprocal help. It turned out that Carmen and Miguel had a pattern of viewing family relationships as opportunities for free labor and services. I wasn't their only victim, just their most extensively exploited one. Even more telling, several family members quietly admitted that they respected my decision to stand up for myself, even if they couldn't say so publicly. My cousin Maria texted me privately. "Good for you! Carmen has been taking advantage of people for years. Someone needed to call her out." The most unexpected support came from my uncle Roberto, my father's brother, who had been divorced for several years and understood the dynamics of being a single adult in a family that prioritized married couples with children. "Sarah, what you did took courage," he told me during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "I've watched Carmen treat you like hired help for years, and I always wondered why you put up with it. Family support should be mutual, not one-sided exploitation." As for Diego, the situation was heartbreaking, but probably inevitable. Carmen made good on her threat to cut off my access to him, telling him that I was too busy with my own life to spend time with him anymore. I sent birthday and Christmas gifts, but I wasn't allowed to see him or have any direct contact. The irony was bitter. After 3 years of being told that I was providing childcare because Diego and I had such a special relationship, Carmen had no problem severing that relationship entirely when it became inconvenient for her. But I had to accept that protecting my own well-being sometimes meant losing access to people I cared about, especially when those relationships were being weaponized against me. The financial compensation made a real difference in my life. $11,200 was more money than I'd ever had in savings. I used part of it to take a long overdue vacation, traveling to Costa Rica for 2 weeks, something I never could have afforded while spending hundreds of dollars per month on Diego's care. I also used some of the money to invest in professional development, taking courses that helped me qualify for a promotion at work. By the following summer, I'd been promoted to a supervisory position with a salary increase of $8,000 per year. More importantly, I used the experience to establish clearer boundaries in all my relationships. I learned to say no without excessive justification. I learned to recognize when people were taking advantage of my helpful nature. I learned that standing up for myself didn't make me selfish or ungrateful. It made me self-respecting. The lawsuit also had an unexpected effect on Carmen and Miguel's relationship with childcare. Without their free babysitter, they had to confront the real cost of maintaining their social calendar. They hired professional babysitters for a few months, but the expense quickly forced them to scale back their evening activities and weekend trips. Carmen called me 8 months after the court ruling, ostensibly to discuss some family event, but really to complain about their childcare costs. "Do you have any idea how expensive babysitters are?" she asked, apparently expecting sympathy. "Yes, I do," I replied. "I calculated it at about $15 per hour for the area, which means you saved approximately $30,000 over 3 years by using me as free childcare." The conversation ended quickly after that. A year later, Rosa called me with an interesting update. Carmen and Miguel had approached her about providing regular babysitting for Diego, offering the same kind of vague promises about it being temporary and occasional that I'd heard years earlier. I told them I'd be happy to babysit sometimes, but that I charge $20 per hour and require at least 24 hours notice except for genuine emergencies, Rosa said. Carmen was shocked that I would expect to be paid. What did you tell her? I told her that Sarah's lawsuit taught me something important about valuing my time and effort. If they want professional quality childcare, they need to pay professional rates. Rosa's support was particularly meaningful because she'd been one of my harshest critics during the legal proceedings. But seeing Carmen try to replicate the same exploitative arrangement with her had opened her eyes to the dynamics I'd been dealing with for years. The family relationships eventually stabilized into a new normal. My parents and I resumed regular contact, though they never acknowledged that I'd been right to pursue compensation. They seemed to view the whole situation as an unpleasant family episode that was best forgotten rather than examined. Carmen and I maintained cordial but distant relations at family gatherings. We exchanged polite small talk and avoided discussing anything substantive. She never apologized for her behavior or acknowledged that her expectations had been unreasonable, but she also stopped asking me for favors of any kind. Miguel was actually easier to deal with than Carmen in the aftermath. He seemed to understand that their approach to family relationships had been problematic, even if he wasn't willing to say so directly. At family events, he made efforts to treat me with respect and include me in conversations, which I interpreted as his way of acknowledging that I'd been treated unfairly. Diego remained off-limits to me for almost 2 years. Carmen's control over access to him was absolute, and she used it as ongoing punishment for my refusal to continue providing free childcare. But when he turned 9, he started asking questions about why I wasn't around anymore, and Carmen apparently decided that maintaining the fiction that I was too busy was becoming difficult. The first time I saw Diego after the lawsuit was at my cousin's wedding in June of 2025. He was shy at first, clearly confused about why we hadn't seen each other for so long. But children are remarkably adaptable, and within an hour, we were talking and laughing like old times. Aunt Sarah, Mom said you got really busy with work and couldn't babysit me anymore, he said while we were getting cake at the reception. I did get busier with work, I agreed. Which was technically true, but I missed seeing you. I missed you too. Maybe you could come over sometime when you're not too busy? The conversation broke my heart, but it also reinforced that I'd made the right decision. Diego deserved to have adults in his life who had healthy boundaries and self-respect. Allowing Carmen to continue exploiting me wouldn't have taught him good lessons about relationships or mutual respect. Looking back on the entire experience, I don't regret filing the lawsuit, even though it cost me relationships and caused significant family drama. The money was important, but the precedent was even more valuable. I learned that I had the right to set boundaries, even with family members. I learned that being helpful didn't mean being available for unlimited exploitation. I learned that standing up for myself was worth the temporary discomfort of conflict. Most importantly, I learned that family obligations should be mutual. Love and support flow both ways in healthy relationships. When one person is consistently giving and another is consistently taking, that's not family support, that's exploitation, regardless of the genetic relationships involved. The lawsuit also had ripple effects beyond my immediate family. Word spread through our extended family and social circle about the situation, and it sparked conversations about the hidden costs of voluntary labor especially the kind that often falls disproportionately on Pa. Unmarried women. Several family friends reached out to share their own stories of being taken advantage of by relatives who assumed their time and resources were freely available. One family friend, a single mother named Elena, told me that my case inspired her to start charging her sister for the regular after-school childcare she'd been providing for free. I realized I was subsidizing my sister's career while struggling to pay my own bills, Elena said. Your lawsuit made me understand that family support doesn't have to mean financial sacrifice. The professional relationships I'd damaged by consistently prioritizing Diego's needs also began to recover. Coworkers who had seen me leave early or decline overtime shifts understood better when they learned about the extent of my childcare responsibilities. Some of them admitted they'd wondered why I was always unavailable for work-related social events or professional development opportunities. My supervisor at work, Janet, the same Janet whose wedding I'd missed for Carmen's anniversary trip, was particularly supportive once she understood the full scope of what I'd been dealing with. Sarah, I had no idea you were essentially working 2 jobs, she said during a performance review meeting. No wonder you seem stressed and distracted sometimes. You were managing full-time work plus 20 hours a week of unpaid childcare. That would burn anyone out. Janet's understanding helped explain some of my workplace dynamics over the previous 3 years. I'd been turning down social invitations, missing networking events, and declining opportunities for professional development because my schedule was consumed by babysitting obligations. My career had been stagnating not because I lacked ambition or ability, but because I'd been trapped in an exploitative arrangement that left me no time or energy for professional growth. With my newfound freedom from constant childcare duties, I was able to focus on my career in ways I hadn't been able to before. I volunteered for special projects, attended industry conferences, and built relationships with colleagues that led to opportunities for advancement. The promotion I received 6 months after the lawsuit was directly related to my increased availability and engagement at work. The personal relationships I'd neglected during my years as the family babysitter also began to flourish again. Friends who had given up on making plans with me because I was always watching Diego slowly started including me in social activities again. I joined a hiking group, started dating, and rediscovered hobbies that had been pushed aside by my constant childcare responsibilities. One of the most therapeutic aspects of reclaiming my life was the simple pleasure of having weekends that belonged to me. For 3 years, I'd lived with the constant anxiety of not knowing when Carmen would call with another babysitting request. Friday evenings meant checking my phone nervously, wondering if my weekend plans would be derailed by a last-minute childcare emergency. Now my weekends were truly mine. I could make plans without the fear of canceling them. I could travel without worrying about being available for babysitting duty. I could simply be spontaneous in ways that hadn't been possible when my schedule was dictated by someone else's needs. The dating aspect of my recovered social life was particularly significant. During the height of my babysitting responsibilities, I'd essentially given up on romantic relationships. It's hard to maintain a dating life when you're constantly canceling plans to watch your nephew, when your apartment is full of children's toys, and when your schedule is unpredictable due to last-minute childcare requests. I'd broken up with a promising relationship in 2022, partly because of the stress and complications caused by my constant babysitting obligations. Mark, a teacher I'd met through friends, had been understanding at first about my family commitments. But after several canceled dates and interrupted evenings due to Carmen's emergencies, he'd grown frustrated with what he saw as my inability to prioritize our relationship. Sarah, I understand that family is important, he'd said during our breakup conversation. But I need to be with someone who has time for a relationship. You're never really available, and when you are, you're stressed about your next babysitting obligation. At the time, I'd been hurt and defensive. Now I could see that Mark had been pointing out a legitimate problem. My life had become so consumed by Carmen's needs that I'd had no emotional or temporal space for my own relationships and goals. After the lawsuit, with my schedule and finances back under my control, I was able to approach dating with a healthier perspective. I met David, a software engineer, through the hiking group I'd joined. He was impressed by the story of my lawsuit, seeing it as evidence of my ability to stand up for myself and set appropriate boundaries. "That took real courage," he said when I explained the situation during one of our early dates. "A lot of people would have just continued to be taken advantage of rather than risk family conflict." David's respect for my decision to pursue legal action was validating in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been surrounded by family members who viewed my lawsuit as evidence of my selfishness and greed. Having someone outside the family drama recognize it as an act of self-respect and appropriate boundary setting helped me feel more confident about my choices. The financial stability I'd gained from the court judgment also opened up possibilities that had been foreclosed during my years of financial strain. I was able to move to a better apartment, one without juice stains on the carpet and crayon marks on the walls. I enrolled in a graduate program to pursue a master's degree in business administration, something I'd been wanting to do for years but couldn't afford while spending hundreds of dollars per month on Diego's care. The MBA program was particularly meaningful because it represented an investment in my future that I'd been unable to make while my resources were being drained by unpaid childcare. The degree would qualify me for higher-level positions and significantly increase my earning potential over the long term. During my first semester, I wrote a case study about my experience for a business ethics class. The professor, Dr. Martinez, used it as an example of how informal family arrangements can become exploitative when there's no recognition of the economic value being provided by one party. Ms. Martinez's case illustrates how traditional gender roles and family expectations can create situations where valuable labor is performed without compensation or recognition, Dr. Martinez explained to the class. The fact that childcare is often viewed as natural work for women doesn't diminish its economic value or the financial burden it places on the provider. Several of my classmates approached me after that lecture to share their own stories of being taken advantage of by family members. It seemed that my experience wasn't as unique as I'd initially thought. Many people, particularly unmarried women, had found themselves providing free labor to family members who viewed their time and resources as infinitely available. One classmate, Rebecca, told me about her experience providing free bookkeeping services for her brother's restaurant. He kept saying it was temporary, just until the business got established, she said. 5 years later, I was still doing his books for free while he was taking expensive vacations and buying luxury cars with the money he saved on professional services. Another classmate, Jennifer, shared that she'd been expected to provide elder care for her grandmother while her siblings, who lived in other states, contributed nothing to the effort. They would visit once a year and praise me for being so devoted to Grandma, but they never offered to help with costs or care responsibilities. It was just assumed that I would handle everything because I was single and lived nearby. These conversations helped me understand that my situation with Carmen and Diego was part of a larger pattern of how family labor is allocated and valued. The people who are most available, most helpful, and most reluctant to create conflict are often the ones who end up bearing disproportionate responsibilities. The gendered aspect of this dynamic was particularly clear in my family. Rosa and I, as unmarried women, were viewed as having unlimited availability for family obligations. Our male cousins were never asked to provide regular child care, elder care, or other unpaid family labor. Even when Rosa started charging for babysitting services, some family members expressed surprise that she would put a price on family time. But the male family members were never expected to provide family time for free. When my cousin Miguel needed help with construction work on his house, he paid other male relatives for their time and expertise. When my uncle needed business advice, he hired professional consultants rather than expecting free labor from family members with relevant skills. The double standard was glaring once I started paying attention to it. Traditionally feminine labor, like childcare, cooking, cleaning, and emotional support, was expected to be provided for free within the family. Traditionally masculine labor, like construction, auto repair, and business services, was compensated even when provided by relatives. This realization helped me understand why my lawsuit had been so threatening to some family members. It wasn't just about the money, it was about challenging the assumption that certain types of labor should be free because they're performed by women for children. By the time I completed my MBA program in 2026, my life had been completely transformed from what it had been during my years as the family babysitter. I'd been promoted to a management position at my company, I was in a stable relationship with David, and I was financially secure in ways I'd never been before. The contrast with Carmen and Miguel's situation was stark. Without free childcare, they'd been forced to make significant lifestyle adjustments. They'd moved to a smaller house than they'd originally planned because childcare costs consumed a large portion of their budget. Carmen had turned down several job opportunities that would have required evening travel or weekend work because professional babysitting for those hours was prohibitively expensive. Miguel's contracting business had struggled because he couldn't take on weekend projects without paying for childcare, and the cost of professional babysitting often exceeded the profit from small jobs. Their social life had contracted significantly as they discovered that date nights and social events were expensive when they required paid childcare. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, but I was struck by how quickly they'd been forced to confront the real economic value of the services I'd been providing for free. The $30,000 in unpaid labor I provided over 3 years represented a significant subsidy to their lifestyle, one they'd taken for granted until it was no longer available. Carmen never acknowledged this reality directly, but her behavior suggested she understood it. She stopped making comments about my selfishness and started treating me with a cautious respect that hadn't been present during our years of conflict. The most telling incident came during Christmas of 2025. Carmen approached me at our family gathering and asked, hesitantly, if I would be willing to watch Diego for a few hours so she and Miguel could go to a holiday party. I would pay you, of course, she added quickly. Whatever the going rate is. The request was remarkable for several reasons. First, it was actually a request rather than an assumption. Second, it included an offer of compensation without any suggestion that I should provide the service for free because we were family. Third, it demonstrated that Carmen had learned, through painful experience, that childcare was a valuable service that deserved compensation. I agreed to watch Diego for the evening, and Carmen paid me $90 for 6 hours of babysitting, which was exactly the market rate. The transaction was businesslike but not unfriendly. Carmen expressed genuine gratitude for my time, and I provided reliable, professional childcare. It was a small interaction, but it represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. Carmen was no longer assuming that my time was freely available to her. I was no longer providing unpaid labor out of guilt or family obligation. We were engaging in a fair exchange that recognized the value of the service I was providing. Diego, now 11, seemed to sense the change in dynamics. He was more polite and appreciative during our time together, perhaps because he'd been told that Aunt Sarah was doing a special favor that his parents were paying for. The entitled attitude he'd sometimes displayed during our babysitting sessions, when he knew I was always available and had no choice but to accommodate his preferences, had been replaced by genuine appreciation for my attention. The evening went smoothly, and when Carmen returned to pick up Diego, she thanked me again and mentioned that she hoped we could arrange similar babysitting exchanges in the future. "It's nice to know I can count on you when I need help," she said. "And I want you to know that I appreciate everything you did for our family over the years, even if I didn't always show it properly." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest Carmen had ever come to acknowledging that her previous expectations had been unreasonable. More importantly, it suggested that our relationship could move forward on a healthier foundation, one based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that September evening in 2023, when I'd finally said no to Carmen's request. Filing the lawsuit had been one of the most difficult decisions I'd ever made, but it had also been one of the most important. The financial compensation had been significant, but the personal growth had been even more valuable. I'd learned to recognize my own worth, to set appropriate boundaries, and to stand up for myself even when it was uncomfortable. I'd discovered that being helpful didn't mean being available for unlimited exploitation, and that family love didn't require financial sacrifice. Most importantly, I'd learned that respect is earned through actions, not words. Carmen's promises that she appreciated my help and would make it up to me somehow had been meaningless when she consistently failed to compensate me for my time and expenses. But her willingness to pay market rates for babysitting services, even 2 years after our legal conflict, demonstrated genuine respect for the value of my labor. The lawsuit had cost me some relationships, at least temporarily, but it had also saved me from a lifetime of being taken advantage of by family members who viewed my resources as communal property. The $11,200 I'd been awarded was just the beginning of the financial benefit. The real value came from establishing my right to fair compensation for my labor. By early 2027, my relationship with Diego had fully recovered from the period of forced separation. Now that our interactions were occasional and properly compensated, they were more enjoyable for both of us. Diego seemed to appreciate my attention more when it wasn't constant and taken for granted. I enjoyed spending time with him more when it didn't come with the stress and resentment that had built up during years of unpaid obligation. The family dynamics had settled into a new equilibrium that was healthier for everyone involved. Carmen and Miguel had learned to budget for childcare as a legitimate household expense. Rosa had established clear boundaries about her availability and compensation expectations. I had reclaimed my autonomy and built a life that reflected my own priorities and goals. The extended family had also absorbed some lessons from the conflict. When my cousin Lisa's daughter started asking family members for free babysitting services, several relatives referenced my lawsuit as a reason why they expected to be compensated for regular childcare. The precedent I'd set had made it easier for other family members to establish appropriate boundaries. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm proud of the courage I found to challenge an exploitative situation, even when it was difficult and socially uncomfortable. The decision to document my expenses, send the invoice, and file the lawsuit required me to overcome years of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize other people's needs over my own well-being. The story of my lawsuit became something of a legend in our extended family and social circle. Some people viewed it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking family members for granted. Others saw it as an inspiring example of someone standing up for their rights despite significant social pressure to remain silent. What I hope people understand from my experience is that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and fair treatment. Love and support should flow in both directions, and no one should be expected to provide unlimited free labor simply because of their genetic relationships or gender. The title, Free Babysitter, that Carmen had casually applied to me for 3 years, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the value of my contributions to their family. I wasn't free. I was undervalued, exploited, and taken for granted. The lawsuit forced everyone to confront the real cost of the services I'd been providing, and to acknowledge that my time and resources had significant value. Today, my relationship with Carmen is cordial but limited. We see each other at family gatherings, exchange pleasantries, and occasionally arrange paid babysitting exchanges. The intimacy and trust that once characterized our sisterly relationship was damaged by years of exploitation and probably can't be fully restored. But we've found a way to coexist respectfully, and that's enough. My relationship with Diego continues to evolve as he grows older and begins to understand more about the adult dynamics that shaped his childhood. He's a bright, kind boy who doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of family conflicts, and I'm grateful that we've been able to maintain a positive relationship despite the complications. The $11,200 I was awarded in the lawsuit was just money, but it represented something much more valuable: recognition of my worth and my right to fair treatment. That recognition, both from the court system and eventually from my family, was worth every moment of conflict and stress that the legal process required. As I continue to build my career, my relationship with David, and my independent life, I carry with me the lessons I learned from that 3-year period of exploitation and the year of legal conflict that followed. I know my worth. I can set appropriate boundaries, and I have the courage to stand up for myself when necessary. The woman who said yes to babysitting Diego just once in March of 2021 was naive about family dynamics and her own value. The woman who filed a lawsuit in October of 2023 had learned to recognize exploitation and had found the strength to fight it. The woman I am today understands that respect is earned through actions, that boundaries are essential for healthy relationships, and that sometimes you have to be willing to risk conflict in order to protect your own well-being. They called me the free babysitter because they thought my time and money were free for the taking. The invoice and lawsuit taught them that nothing valuable is ever truly free, and that even family relationships require fairness, respect, and mutual consideration to survive and thrive.